Good evening. I'm Mark Andrus, the Episcopal Bishop of the Diocese of California, which is the Episcopal Church in the Bay Area. All of the Bay Area excluding San Jose. I'm delighted to welcome you to the third of this excellent series sponsored by the Episcopal Impact Fund, asking the question over these three parts of what should the Episcopal Impact Fund be now in relation to social justice, poverty. And I think my task is to say something about that Episcopal part about it. There are times when people who have based their lives in faith communities and are doing great work of justice, the larger world tends to want to elide that part of their lives and pretend that that foundation of social justice is not in their faith, whether it's Buddhist or Jewish or Hindu or Islam or Christianity, and somehow that foundation is not really part of it. This happens with the memory of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King all the time. He's often called just Dr. Martin Luther King, and the Reverend part, which meant so much to him. As he said, he was a preacher and the son of a preacher and the grandson of a preacher. This was foundational for who he was and how he went about bringing forth justice and repairing the beloved community. So what is it about the Episcopal Church that provides a foundation for the work of Episcopal Impact Fund? It is, of course, work that is done in partnership with people who come from many different faith backgrounds or no faith backgrounds, but in fact, the base of our work comes from a particular strand of what our inspiring presiding bishop calls the Episcopal branch of the Jesus movement. That is who we are. And there is something about it that has its own particular charism, its own particular gift. It doesn't make it better than other bases or even secular bases. It makes it different and distinct. And we can say a few things about that. The great lay Black woman theologian in the 20th century, Verna Dozier, wrote a landmark book called The Dream of God. And in it, Verna talked about how God has a dream of justice and peace and integrity for all of creation. And that dream has been deferred time and again by the choices of human beings. She dates certain points of time when that dream was powerfully betrayed. The first she starts with in the Christian era with Constantine, when a church that was distinct from the empire became the religion of the empire. And this has happened many times in many places. When the Episcopal Church made a new partnership, as it has done with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and other churches, but when we made a new partnership with the Moravian Church, we in the House of Bishops of the Episcopal Church welcomed bishops of the Moravian Church to join us at one of our House of Bishops meetings in North Carolina, Western North Carolina. And they said something quite startling. They said that they alone, among many of the Protestant denominations, had never had a country. They were never the religion of a country. And thus, they said, they had never had an army. And thus, they said, they had never been tempted to use an army for the ends of exerting power. That was a stunning statement to me. The same cannot be said about the Episcopal Church. The Episcopal Church, part of the Anglican Communion, grew out of the Church of England. And we have been part of two great empires, the British Empire, which then became the Commonwealth, and of course, the American empire. How is it that people come to the Episcopal Church and find it a place of generosity, a haven from injustice, and a champion of justice, an ally? How did that happen? Well, one, it doesn't happen by accident. It takes work. Today in the Episcopal Diocese of California, there are hundreds of people taking part actively, week by week, in a 10-month series called Sacred Ground, which is learning to understand systemic racism and confront the racist past of the Episcopal Church and own our own place in it. This is the kind of work that we've been trying to do in other arenas for a long time. We are the third largest, the Anglican Communion, third largest Christian body in the world. And of the other two, we represent, those three together, about 2 billion people on the earth. And of that number, only those in the Anglican Communion ordain women to this day. That did not happen by accident. It was a huge struggle within our church. And in some parts of the communion, it's not a struggle that has been settled. Even less settled is the place of recognizing the rights of LGBTQ people in the communion. And the Episcopal Church in the United States and 17 other countries that comprise the Episcopal Church struggled mightily for the place where we could recognize more fully as we have yet, the rights of LGBTQ people. So this is work, and it is work to which we commit ourselves because we believe it to be in alignment with the dream of God. But for me, the foundation of this is to say that it is grace and the operation of the Holy Spirit, the work of the Holy Spirit, that finally is the warrant, is the energy, is the wind that fills our sails, and that will bring the world to justice, that will repair the beloved community. You and I must do our part. We must work towards reconciliation. We must use the tools of nonviolence to do so. We must inquire rigorously of our own lives and purify our consciences, as the Reverend Dr. King said. But finally, it is the work of God, that dream which cannot be deferred, which will carry us to what Teilhard de Chardin called the Omega point, where God's dream will be realized for all of life. This is what we believe. And with me, we believe this with many people in our faith and in other faiths. It's really good to have you welcomed into this space at this time. I believe this panel is so capacious, doing such beautiful work, as I believe the work of Episcopal Impact Fund is fundamental to the health, as it has been for a very long time in the Bay Area. I hope you enjoy this last conference of the series, which has the title, Where Do We Go From Here? The title of the Reverend Dr. King's last book before his assassination. Thank you so much. I'm handing this off to the person who has shaped and led all three of these sessions, Robert Greene.
Bishop Mark, good evening, and thank you first for your inspiring message, and then for the really generous welcome. And I'll share with you, as I often do at a time like this, that anything I've been able to contribute to what has really been a fabulous series, it's because I've been working with some really good people. Panels 1 and 2 were dynamite, and no doubt that this third one will be as well. I do want to mention, though, even though we're heading toward the end of the series, that quite honestly, the work will continue. And we know that to be the case. We know it's still needed in our world, unfortunately, but I'm absolutely convinced that we have the right people to engage. As we get started tonight, I just wanted to do a little bit of a recap, a level set, if you will, just to remind us how we've gotten to this point where we're asking the question, where do we go from here? And so it really began in October as we grounded ourselves um, in some really exciting scholarship that focused on individual and collective skill sets, what we call cultural competency. And what does it look like for us to be in a continual growth mindset, to broaden our perspective, to understand things beyond the limit of what we've experienced or what our background has afforded us a chance to understand? And how do we bring these skills together to really engage in a different way, to position ourselves as different, really different partners, whether it's for the Episcopal Impact Fund or other organizations with whom we are working or connected? What's our responsibility to continue to grow our own skill set? And how do we use that in turn to be more effective agents for change, to really support the kind of world that we would hope to grow into and to live in? Not only are we trying to do that individually, but we also want to make sure that the organizations that we're a part of, the communities that we're a part of, are developing what we call a corporate skill set in that work as well. How do we envision things in a different way from the past? How do we lean creatively into innovative solutions that can really bring change to the experiences that members of our community are having? And it's not enough to simply focus on the individual. What we learned in panel two, with again, two terrific partners, is that we have to think about this work at more of a systemic level, even than an individual level. Any of you who are systems theorists, you understand that systems impact the experience of populations. And even though the American story is replete with examples of exceptionalism, if we want to understand the dynamics that we are seeing throughout the Bay Area and around the country, more importantly, if we want to interrupt these cycles of dislocation for individuals and for families and for communities, we have to think about engaging systemically. And we spend a great deal of time making some clear distinction about what it means to think systemically as opposed to thinking individually. And it was a really great opportunity for us to reframe our strategy and our approach. And those two panels obviously come together tonight with our opportunity to figure out, where do we go? And to support me in the conversation and to support you all in the conversation, we have some amazing, amazing contributors and friends of the Episcopal Impact Fund. Obviously, we have to start with Kathleen Perino, who has been the dynamic executive director of the Episcopal Impact Fund since 2011. Brilliant, passionate, and an incredible leader. I know that none of this would have happened without her vision and without her leadership. And apparently, Kathleen and I share the same superpower. We just keep really good company. So Kathleen is going to join us tonight, but she's not all. Also really delighted to have Mario Paz, who is the executive director of the Good Samaritan Family Resource Center. And if you don't know Mario, you are in for an incredible treat. He has more than 30 years of passionate nonprofit and social justice leadership, advocating for children, youth, families, and communities. Mario walks his walk as well as talking his talk, and he's going to be an incredible resource for us as we think about how we continue to marshal resource and community to move forward in this work together. He served on numerous boards of directors and currently, in fact, serves as the vice chair of San Francisco's Immigrant Rights Commission. Mario has been a terrific asset and an award-winning leader and contributor in communities throughout the Bay Area. And we're delighted to have him with us as well. Our third panelist is Dr. Ayanna Bennett, who is the founding director of the Office of Health Equity at the San Francisco Department of Public Health. Dr. Bennett has again been an incredible agent of support and change throughout the community, not only serving as a pediatrician, who really appreciated the stark differences in racial groups that produced health disparities. And the care and the differences in those experiences couldn't simply be attributed to class and to lifestyle. And that truth and that guide has become visible for her over the years. And we really have to make sure that if we're trying to bring health equity, then we also have to lean into the work of bringing racial equity. For much of this year in 2020, Dr. Bennett served as the incident commander of the San Francisco COVID-19 response, but she's returned to this founding work at the Office of Health Equity, and it's continuing her involvement with the Department of Public Health, where she's been in leadership since 2015. At the end of the panel, we're going to be closed out tonight by Jennifer Brooks. And if you don't know Jennifer, she is the board chair for the Episcopal Impact Fund and is herself a brilliant and talented nonprofit executive who's been incredibly creative and innovative in the solutions that she's been able to bring to addressing a lot of these systemic issues. And again, her partnership with Kathleen is emblematic of really the resources that Episcopal Impact Fund and the new strategy that they're bringing to bear in fulfilling their mission to really partner in a new way, to think about how they can grant in a new way, to think about how they can begin to move and shape the perspective that members of the community have for all folks who are in the Bay Area, no matter what their particular circumstances. As Bishop Mark said, we're all part of God's family. And so we want to create energy and structure to allow us to step into this work together. I'm excited to have been a part of this series. I'm even more excited to hear what our brilliant panelists are going to share with you tonight. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome them out to the stage and engage in what will be a riveting conversation that I am sure will bring you delight and a whole lot of insight into our work. So Kathleen, come on out, and Mario and Ayana, I'm going to ask you all to come out now as well, and we will begin. Welcome, welcome. Kathleen, I would actually love to start with you in no small part because Episcopal Impact Fund has done this whole thing and brought us all together. But I think that you also bring this brilliant insight into how we can think about moving forward, how we can bring this energy and thought into action and bring and speak a new truth to power. So as Dr. King and Reverend Dr. King wrote so many years ago, Kathleen, where do we go from here?
Well, that is a good question. I'd like to just turn back a minute and say, how did we get here, if that's all right? Obviously, the past year has been a series of what the bishop likes to call overlapping crises. We have the COVID pandemic and all that that meant and all the disparities in how people were affected depending on their race and their class. And then, of course, the renewed call for racial justice, where what we all knew just became something we couldn't turn away from anymore. That this racism in this country is systemic and that it's part of what keeps people poor and sick. We didn't disagree with that, but we knew that we had to do more than what we had been doing, that more was called for. When I look at where, so we started this, we said we're gonna talk and we're gonna listen, which is much harder and sometimes much more important than talking. And we were lucky to find Robert. We were lucky to have these wonderful panelists, not just tonight, but in the two previous sessions, who really got us grounded and centered. Now, those conversations aren't over. That listening isn't over. We will continue to talk and to educate ourselves and to try to transform ourselves. But again, that isn't enough. Conversation isn't enough. It's the necessary first step. So we have to look at our work as an organization, not just the staff, but our board very much also. We need to take a lens to our grant making and make sure that we are keeping this front and center, the racial oppression that results in so many people of color being poor. That's not a coincidence, is it? That when we look at all the organizations that we fund, they all do work in communities of color. That might be true in other parts of the country. I think someone talked about Appalachia at another one. It's not exclusive, but here in the Bay Area, that is an almost universal phenomenon. We're going to continue working with Robert. We think that we need a guide. We need an expert on this. And he's going to lead our next board session and just really hopefully get a really good, really substantial conversation going. And then, and I think Jen will go more into this at the end of the evening, but we're also for the first time really seriously looking at funding advocacy. Advocacy can mean a lot of different things, but I'm thinking about influencing government policy and action in a way that addresses racism and benefits people living in poverty. So that's something what I looking, into my crystal ball can predict of where Episcopal Impact Fund is going to go from here.
Kathleen, really, really appreciate that. You said so many rich things there, and I think most importantly is continuing to interrogate whether our past model and our past systems will be able to bring the change that we know we're going to have to bring as we face an ever-evolving crisis and a dynamic environment. One thing that's certainly been true about the history of this country is that racism and dislocation and poverty have unfortunately been persistent. So we can't do the same old things that we've always done to try to create a new set of circumstances in the back end. So I really appreciate the leadership that you and Episcopal Impact Fund are thinking about in this area. Mario, I'd love for you to speak a little bit, if you will, about both where do we go from here, and then in particular is this angle of advocacy as well. What does it look like to be an advocate for communities that have historically experienced this kind of dislocation and who are in need of us thinking and engaging with them in a different way?
Thank you, Robert. I think the first thing we need to do is really acknowledge that we are in a struggle. And we need more people to join in that struggle, and that we need to expand our notions of what is a just and good society. I think about Good Samaritan and its roots in the Settlement House movement and its Episcopalian roots. And it was founded by people of faith who had certain values about justice and what was right and what was wrong. And they didn't proceed with words, they proceeded with actions, and they founded the Settlement House movement in 1800s. Jane Addams was one of the founders of the movement, the mother of social work, founded Hull House, challenged the status quo in every way, shape, and form very early on about poverty and its perception about poverty and the acceptance of people that were different, and did it with actions and fought and testified in its Congress and fought and organized. And in our organization, we have always stood by our community when they have fought to protect their families, to build a better future for themselves and their children. And now our community, they're distressed, they're angry, and they're asking for change. And so I think the first thing we need to do is we need to figure out a way to really root out the systemic racism and inequities that continue to sort of be embedded in our institutions, in our practices, in our workplaces. We can no longer stand on the sidelines and just talk about it. I think we really have to really sort of lead with actions. So I think about some of the work we've been doing in San Francisco just recently. I helped co-found a organization called the San Francisco Latino Parity and Equity Coalition. Because even before the pandemic, we saw how the growing wealth gap and income inequality in our city was really impacting communities of color, both Latino and African American. And we felt we really needed to, challenge the status quo, and we need to work to changing policies and really challenging our leaders in our city to really not just talk about racial justice in an equity lens, but to actually begin to shake things up in ways that we've never done before. And so we now have an office of racial justice in San Francisco, and every city department now is putting together a racial justice and equity plan that they're presenting, right? So there's real commitments that are being made to change institutions. And at the community level, we continue to fight. And I think it's going to continue to be a struggle. You know, we live in a democracy, and democracy depends on compromise, right? And we're stuck in these extreme ideologies, and we're trying to push things that make people feel really uncomfortable. But I think that's what we need to do. It's, you know, we've put out statements like everyone else. We can put out words and we can say we stand with you. But at the end of the day, is that going to change the embedded practices that continue historically to sort of promote institutional racism, systemic racism, inequality? You know, how are we going to challenge our market system? You know, we have a market system, right, that is leaving many people behind. It's run amok. How can we make it fairer? What policies do we need to change? So I think we just need more people to join in that struggle and to come together to really begin to see the change that we need to make.
Mario, thank you so much for that. As you were speaking these really powerful words, I'm thinking of one of my favorite poets, you know, my fraternity brother, Langston Hughes, who once wrote a poem called Live Your Creed. And Bishop Mark, no offense, but one of the lines in there is that I'd rather see a sermon than hear one any day. I'd rather one would walk with me than just to show the way. And so this notion of how do we convert our value into action, I think is such a really critical aspect of it. And, you know, Dr. Ayanna Bennett, I want to bring you forward into the conversation here, because you've been one who not only speaks truth to power, who not only recognizes and lifts up and calls by name the incredibly destructive impacts of race, and more importantly, racism in our work. How do we continue to lean into that effort and to bring more people into the vision that you have, but more importantly, the courage to dismantle some of those systems that ironically we began to recognize anew because of COVID? Even before, you know, we saw the public murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis.
I feel like we are learning things we know already. So you could have asked me a year ago if there was a pandemic, who would be hit hardest? And most of us probably could have guessed which communities would be hit the hardest. And that is because we live in a culture which the engine that was built for us over the last several hundred years has a function to take in anything and move the good parts or benefits to one group and the bad parts and cost to another group. And it does that with jobs, it does that with weather, it does that with pandemics, it does that with anything we deliver to it, because that is what the engine does. And so trying to tweak that is not probably going to be enough for most of the things that we want to see happen. So when you're looking at what to do next, I always, and I get a lot of answers to that question. We need to fix poverty. People always have very deep, passionate beliefs in the large structural changes that need to happen. And I agree with them. But unless they happen to be a very passionate community organizer or their congressman, that is not their role. Their role is to fix their place. So whatever part you play in the world, the chances are the rules and policies that govern that space were written by people who openly thought racism was a perfectly fine way to organize a country, because that wasn't that long ago. So unless you just developed something in the last 30 years, that's who wrote your rules. That's who decided how your work should be done, which means it needs to be interrogated again. And I mean that in not just looked at, but looked at with some prejudice that you in fact might be guilty. So we need to take that stance of not blaming the past, but not just accepting everything that came to us as if it were fine. And I think that many people rightly find that difficult. There's a reason that diets fail. It is really hard to change your day-to-day behavior. But this is not about our personal lives. It's about what it is we want the world to be. So this is higher level mission, this is passion, this is faith. So these are the big things that require you to make those kinds of sacrifices. So we're going to have to just do it. But it'll be in your backyard, not prayers for the people of some other country. Fix your office.
I love that point. We have to start as locally as possible. I remember when I lived in the Boston area, a friend of mine had actually spent a lot of time in Greece and hadn't spent a lot of time in Waltham, hadn't spent a lot of time in Watertown. And these were towns that were next door to where this particular friend lived. And I thought that fundamentally there was a huge gap in understanding the world. And I think too easily we can fall into that gap, and we train ourselves to look elsewhere for the problems that may resonate in our heart when they're actually right in front of us. And we have to get more proximate, and it has to start at home. And, after George Floyd was killed, and even after, fortunately, Christopher Cooper was not killed in Central Park, a lot of folks were asking, well, what can we do? What can we do? And I said, well, actually, why don't you start talking to that uncle of yours who has, routinely said the wrong thing, who's perpetuated racism. Tell him he's no longer welcome in your house at your dinner table, because that's not the kind of place that you all create. All right. It says in the scripture, choose ye this day whom you will serve. But as for me and my house, well, for you and your house, make sure that you're being anti-racist and communicate that, and be an agent of dismantling that wherever you can go. And so this notion of how do we lean into what Maya Angelou says, do the best you can for as long as you can, but then know better, and then subsequently do better. So Kathleen, what has been some of that process as you've helped to pivot, some of the work in EIF in terms of how we are trying to know better in order to do better, to confront a problem that's been completely intransigent?
Well, if I could just start by responding to Ayanna that, we need to interrogate our own systems. I think it is easier to see the splinter in someone else's eye than the log in your own, to quote another great philosopher. It also makes me think about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who I read a long time ago, so I hope I don't get this wrong, but his concept of cheap grace. It's very easy to say we're against racism. This is wrong. But when we have to start making sacrifices in order to change the system, that's where things get really, really difficult and really challenging. And I think that in the Dolly Klug's book, she talks about that, about how hard that is to interrogate your own systems. In terms of, what we could do differently, and we've already started thinking about this. I love orderly systems. I like to get paperwork, and I like it to be all lined up and all perfect, and I like all my questions answered, and I like the numbers to make sense. But that may not be necessary, at least not to the degree that we privilege it now. That may be unintentionally excluding wonderful programs that we should be funding because they can't wrap their arms around the paperwork. So that's a very simple example, but one that comes to mind.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful example, because for me, it begs the question, to what degree are our practices and our systems actually aligned with driving the outcomes that we want to see? And we have to interrogate those routinely. But, Mario, I think we also have to bring more people into the conversation for defining the utility of some of the practices that we may have and have privileged because of our own biases, when in fact they're not very useful. So how do we continue to broaden the conversation and include the communities that we say we want to serve, that we say we want to partner with, that we say we want to lift up? How do we actually include them in a conversation where they have sufficient power to participate in their own liberation?
Thank you. I can just give you examples what we've tried to do within our own organization and within some coalitions that we're involved in. One is we invest in relationship. I mean, we know that the key. You have to make the investment in relationship, and you need to listen. And it's not about feeling safe in conversations that you have. It's about being transparent and open. And that requires building the trust to a relationship. So in our work that we've done in recent years in Bayview Hunters Point, for example, that evolved very organically, it was really the vision of a pastor of a community church and one of our staff who saw a neighborhood around him changing dramatically, and saw historically a community that has been primarily a Black community going through what we call community in transition, where now the largest population group is Asian, actually, and the second is Latino. It's changing dramatically, right? And one of the things we felt early on is we needed to really invest in relationship in the communities so they can come together and understand how our fates are intertwined. Brown, Black, Asian, how we need to lift each other collectively. And the only way that was going to happen is by, again, building relationships. That means being with them every step of the way, through thick and thin, in every conversation. And we did that by just being there, by being at every meeting that they called for, by joining with them, by building resources together. And what we've tried to create is just a community that understands that our fates are together and that we're going to build together, build a better world for all of our communities. And it's hard work. It's not easy. Yeah. So I think it starts with that. And it's really deciding to really invest in the relationship, in the authentic relationship.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that, Mario. It's so powerful. There's also a simplicity that I'm detecting in what you're describing. You know, I used to tell my math students when, in a former life when I was a teacher, particularly about algebra, which was that transition between arithmetic and mathematics. I said, look, algebra, it ain't easy, but it is simple. There is a simplicity of investing in relationship and not simply being in transactional connection with folks. And, you mentioned the Bayview and Hunters Point, and because he mentioned that, Ayanna, I'm going to ask you to take me back to 3rd Street, right? And what does it look like to invest in a community and in relationships and to be proximate enough to build the trust so that we can dismantle the systems that have allowed oppression and health disparity, for instance, to persist? How do we do it? How do we get more people to believe that we are all our brothers and our sisters' keeper, and that to live in that spirit of Ubuntu, that we can't be everything that we're called to be until everybody else is doing the same? So, tell us a little bit about what you learned, in that kind of 3rd Street journey that we still need to be engaging in 2020 as we confront these new challenges.
So when I left residency, I was asked by a group in the community to help them start a youth clinic, which is what I did. And I was there for about 12 years, no, 10 years, and it's now 15 years old. But that experience was both just educational and how do you do this, but also humbling in its education. And that is because I didn't understand either. I mean, Bayview looks a lot like the places where I grew up, but it's not the same. It's not exactly the same. So part of what allows us to have these wrong ideas about one another is that part of the system's job is to keep people separated. You really can't have a persistent sense of other people as less than if you have equal interaction and peer interaction. If they're kept in a social class that is visibly below you, I think people have been able to maintain it. But to be able to maintain that when your lives are intertwined is much more difficult. And so the system kept people apart. And realistically, when they've done those studies and show that in white Americans, 99% of them don't have any, I think it's somewhere in the early 90s, somewhere in the 90s, don't have any non-white people in their Facebook, like they were not attached to anybody. When we live in those kind of bubbles, it means that we have these huge gaps of ignorance.
Are you talking to me?
I am not talking to you. Please stop. Sorry about that. We have these huge gaps of ignorance. And then one of culture's functions is to tell you what is true when you don't know. So I don't know how this works. It looks like police. I have a little bit of an idea. So we have a lot of those ideas about people we don't see very often. So like, when's the last time that most Americans interacted with a Native American person? Not often. And so what do you have? You have a bunch of old TV shows and like, you don't have anything to base that understanding on. So we need those relationships to clean up the information we're working with, because we don't have what we need from our life experiences most of the time to really play out fairness, to play out compassion, to do the things that we feel like must be done. But those things all require a certain amount of connection. And we don't have that necessarily. So you really do have to fix that broken piece before you can make everything work. And some of that is about not having shared history. There's an enormous amount of gap between what the average Black person believes American history is and what the average white person believes American history is. They're not the same thing, despite having been told the same thing by teachers. And that's just because we are geographically separated, that people are living their lives in different corners. I always use, I have a pair of elderly white friends, the example of Laquan McDonald. So this young man was shot in Chicago by a police officer. There are dozens of witnesses, mostly Black and brown people. They are not interviewed. They're just told to go away. There's a cover up. So that exploded when the tape came out and people found out and there's protests. But realistically, if there are dozens of people who saw something, the community knew that there was a man driving around who worked for the city who could shoot people, and it was fine. So they lived with that for a year, in the reality that there's a wandering murderer in their purview who can do what he wants. So the people who are annoyed that people are marching down the street and, oh my God, how did that happen? It happened in the course of the way life works for a whole group of people. And it's shocking because of the lack of understanding, not because of its difference from the way the rest of the world works. So that getting that ignorance and that void of information to be filled with something. I mean, if the best you can do is read a book, read a book. The Great Migration, that's a great one. But whatever you can do to fill in the gaps that we've been left with, it makes it so much easier to make the right decisions.
Yeah, it's such a brilliant point you're making. You know, once heard somebody describing a lot of the unrest this summer, saying, look, the anger is not new. They're just more mobile phone cameras. You know, that's what's different. We're catching some of this on tape, but the anger and the dislocation and the hurt and the pain and the racism, it's not new. You know, it's not a 2020 issue. And so this notion of how we can live such separate lives in America, right next door to each other, part of me thinks sometimes that it's intentionality.
Mhm.
You know, it's like the construct of being colorblind. You don't come to color blindness, you know, by accident. You come to it by intentionality. There is no way you can look at me and not recognize I'm a Black man. And I can promise you that my Blackness has played an incredible role in shaping the experiences that I had. And likely my experiences have been different than some of my white colleagues. We have to learn to render one another visible and not invisible. And in so doing, you know, we'll come to discover that there are many amazing talents that we're simply hemorrhaging because of our bias and our ignorance.
Mhm.
You know, Kathleen, I love the point that you made earlier about a different way to engage with our partners and our communities through our granting, because it will allow us to see differently and it'll allow us to bring more innovative strategies. Can you speak a little bit more to that in terms of what you're anticipating could be different about the future of grant making, not only at EIF, but you know, potentially across a number of social service agencies and partners?
Well, I do know, and this is more in response to COVID, that a lot of foundations, and I don't know if Mario's experienced this too, are saying, you know, all that reporting we asked, you got enough on your plate. We don't need that this year. Or at least maybe we need a greatly simplified version of that. But I think that what that will lead us to ask ourselves is, well, do we need it at all? I mean, why are the organizations that are out there engaging, doing the incredibly hard work that they do, also having to spend their time, I don't want to call it a power game, but the power differential is definitely there. And they're being asked by foundations to spend this valuable time responding to what we see as our needs and goals, which shouldn't be privileged in this relationship. It's the needs and goals of the people that we're all trying to serve that should be front and center. Mario, are you seeing any difference in what foundations are requesting?
Some, but I think the institutions of philanthropy are one of those institutions that need to join in the struggle and be challenged in so many ways. And if I may, Robert, I wanted to go back to a point you make about being invisible and these bubbles, because it's interesting in our work how we see what's happened in our public school system in San Francisco and in our region. So let's think about this a little bit. So in San Francisco and in the adjoining region, more than 30% of students attend private schools.
Mm-hmm.
And the majority of the 10 private schools are white, about 80%. And the majority of the students in our public schools are students of color. And talk about a bubble, right? And after the pandemic hit, and everyone had, you know, schools had to pivot to distance learning and so forth. You know, I remember a story in the first few months of a young child who had just gotten their Chromebook. Parents, you know, English language learners didn't know how to support, lived in a household with 10 people. The little child is 8 years old, in a little closet, trying to figure out how to learn, because they don't have space for a desk, have poor Wi-Fi, right? That was a transition that we had to support, but that was sort of the scenario that we were faced, this pandemic sort of put the inequality, it just threw it into our faces in ways we've never seen before.
Yeah.
It shocked us, right? The disparities. And we knew this before, just like Dr. Bennett said,
That's right.
this has been going on for a long. This was surprised by the disproportionate impact of COVID on communities of color. You know, that we knew was coming. But I guess Robert, we can get rid of racist people, but how do we get rid of the racist practices and institutions? That's our struggle.
Right. It's a tremendous question. Yes.
That's our struggle, whether it's in philanthropy, whether it's in government and private. How do we get rid of those embedded practices? I feel, and we need more people to join us in that struggle to root that out. Because that's what we're trying to figure out at the community level, through our coalitions, through our work. I know San Francisco is leading in some efforts. Dr. Bennett would tell you her department's putting together a plan, and every department's trying to put together a plan, right? But it's not easy, you know, but that's the question. How do we root that?
Yeah, I think it's such a brilliant point, Mario, because, you know, I think of what the pandemic has illuminated in terms of the healthcare disparities, which unfortunately were predictable, the educational disparities, which again were unfortunately predictable, the wealth disparities, which were unfortunately predictable, and it's exacerbated, you know, a whole host of conditions that we should have seen coming. And if we are not positioning ourselves to dismantle the systemic issues that are at the root, they will continue to cycle and they will continue to persist. And so we have to go beyond thinking about the lone bad actor or, you know, the racist behavior, and think about the racism. Let's not focus on the classist behavior and focus on the classism. The isms are inherently structural, they're systemic, they're institutional, and we have to dismantle them in an appropriate way. Otherwise, when the next pandemic hits, we'll be able to probably with a really good degree of accuracy predict who will bear more of the brunt of those ills. Where do we go from here? I think we have to get proximate. I think we have to get relational. I think we have to get systemic, but more importantly, I think we have to get courageous and ask ourselves, you know, what's a little bit more that we can do? Kathleen, you'd mentioned Dolly Chug's book, and she has a terrific monthly newsletter that comes out, and one of the early postings was literally called 10% More. And so the encouragement was, what if each of us simply decided to do 10% more to be a builder and not just a believer, to be an activist, a co-conspirator in helping to create the world that we want, where we're thinking, you know, we don't actually want to eliminate poverty, we want to build wealth. Building wealth will eliminate poverty. Simply trying to eradicate poverty or lift people out of it, the standard between poverty and a living wage is still light years away in California. So we need to think about our work differently. We need to bring a different kind of energy and focus to what we're trying to do. Fortunately, we have some great people who are starting the work, but it takes an entire army of folks to do it. Mario, you're a bad brother, but you're not, you can't do it by yourself.
No, we can't.
You know, Ayana, you're doing amazing things, but we need more people. You know, public health is a big department. Kathleen, EIF is amazing, but it's not the only foundation in town. You know, so how do we continue to recruit people into our work and build the relationships that will allow us to keep going forward? Mario, you were going to respond?
No, yeah, it just reminded me of something. I just think about, you know, we were, for so long, the Black community has been crying out about the brutality they've been experiencing under the people that we rely on to protect us, right? We weren't listening until we saw the pictures of what was happening to George Floyd, right? No one was listening. This has been going on for a long time. Nobody listens. That's, you know, so that's where we have to take on some personal responsibility.
Mhm.
We need to really
Yeah,
and we need to join.
yeah.
We need to join this. We need people's help. It's just we can't do it alone.
That's right.
In our work, you know, we know that there's no better way to stabilize a family that they have a stable home, just a place to live, right? And so we join with a lot of coalitions to try to promote more affordable housing, to build more housing for people, for low-income folks. But then there's this fight on the other side, right? The NIMBYism, you know, in other regions, right? Because affordable housing has been racialized, right? They say, oh, we don't want to support it because it's going to bring our properties down, or it's going to crowding conditions. No, that's not what you mean. We don't want those Black and brown folks in our community.
That's right.
Right? I'm just being honest. That we know that's what it is.
Yeah, that's at the root of redlining.
That's the root of
That's at the root of oppressive and predatory lending and oppressive lending.
Yeah, but I would tell people there's no better way to lift all of us. If a family can just be in a stable home, guess what? Their children will do better in school. Right? There'll be less mental health issues, trauma. Why can't we support that? Why can't we all embrace that and not fight it? Why is the pressure always on San Francisco a couple? Why can't San Mateo build more housing? Marin County, all the other counties join together, right? Yeah. It will lift all of us. It's frustrating, but it was that question I asked you. You know, how we root, it's the embedded racism. You know, how do we change that?
Yeah, it's our most intractable problem. You know, I don't call it our original sin. And this goes back to Ayanna, part of what you said. Our original sin, I think, was dislocating our indigenous population. But our most persistent evil has been racism. You know, and so we have to learn to root that out if we're going to try to address these problems that we see. There's a question in the chat for us, and would love for you all to think about it. Kathleen, you might even want to start with a response to it. And the question is, what can people in the parishes do to help? All right, and so in particular with the Episcopal Impact Fund and our connection to the church, what are some early thoughts that come to mind for you? Kathleen, if you can lead us off with maybe one or two things that come to mind, and I'll ask Ayanna and Mario to respond as well.
So just riffing off of what Mario was just saying, be courageous in your own community if affordable housing is being proposed, or go out and find out why it's not being built in your community. Why is it always, as Mario said, being built in cities that are already impacted, with schools that are not, that are already overburdened, with lack of infrastructure, with no jobs, whatever the issues are in inner cities like Oakland and like San Francisco? Some needs to be built there, but why is it always built there?
Yeah. Ayanna, Mario, what do you think? What else can people in parishes do to help?
The idea that we are not sure what to do, I think is only partially true. There are people doing good work. Go look for them and see if what they're doing would work for you. There are foundations that are openly working on social justice from a anti-racist lens. What are they doing? There are parishes, they may not be near you, but there are churches who have really, really stepped into this space. And the more that you investigate what they're doing, the more you publicize and make visible to your neighbors what you're doing, the ideas and improvement can be inspired to move along. So I don't think we're all in the dark. There is good work happening. It's not enough. It's not broad enough. We need more people, but it's not that it's not happening. It's been happening for the last 300, 400 years. People have always been trying to eat away at this system. And sometimes they succeed a little bit and sometimes they don't, but there have been victories in the struggle. So find out who's winning a little bit and try to come and support them by joining them in the fight.
Love that,
That's
Ayana.
a beautiful point. Yeah.
And
Mario,
and
anything else that you'd want to add?
I would just add, support your small local Black-owned and other people of color-owned businesses. Put your money, invest your money in banks that don't have a history of predatory lending. Put your money in credit unions. Put your, one of my board members started Beneficial State Bank, and look, do some research. Educate your congregations. There's ways that you can do little things every day in terms of where you invest your money, where you purchase, where you do things that can really support our communities and really lift them up. So, yeah.
I love that point. And when we think about what folks in parishes can do, they can do things individually, and then they can do things in the collective. And one of the most radical opportunities is to support wealth building and to circulate dollars in dislocated and marginalized communities, to circulate dollars more. That can be a really important benefit because not everybody's going to have the same access to home ownership, but home ownership is a portion of wealth building. And so what are the other ways that we can continue to invest? And everybody has the opportunity to do that. So parish leaders, challenge your parishioners and say, what are we going to do? On your calendar, mark it. How many times a month are you going to invest and patronize businesses, communities that are not your own? It is a brilliant way to bring some radical change to the conditions that we're seeing. Quite honestly, I can talk with you all night. I can, but folks we want to make sure we respect your time. And Jen Brooks, I want to bring you out because we'd love for you to have an opportunity just to speak a little more specifically about EIF and what the Episcopal Impact Fund, how this group and this agency is stepping up to be part of the change that we want to see, and give you an opportunity to close us out. Before I go, I just want to say a huge thank you to Kathleen, to Mario, and to Ayana for all the brilliant insight that you all have brought with us. Dr. Bennett, keep doing what you're doing. Mario, please persist in your effort to build relationships. And Kathleen, I can't wait to see you soon to continue doing the work together. So Jen, I turn it over to you and thank you.
Thank you, Robert. And let me add my thanks to each of our speakers, to Bishop Mark, to Robert, to Mario, Ayana, Kathleen. So much insight and wisdom, and thank you for sharing that. I know we're a bit over our time, so I will go quickly. But what I wanted to do was just kind of go back to the beginning and talk about where we're going from here. There are really three ways that we at Episcopal Impact Fund have been looking at how to become more of a race equity organization. And that's a concept that a group called Equity at the Center describes as being focused on proactively counteracting race inequities, both inside the organization and outside of the organization. So that's sort of where we're moving. And as we've kind of alluded, we've been looking in three areas. One is our grant making, and we're farthest along on that journey. The second is on kind of our consciousness raising education of ourselves and of our community. And the third is policy advocacy. Kathleen already spoke about a bit about our grant making, about the consciousness raising education. The one thing that I will say is that part of our reflection process, what we recognized was that as an institution, we have a unique access to a set of donors and supporters who might not be part of other conversations about race. We are a trusted institution with those, and we really have a responsibility to use what the author Dolly Chugg called ordinary privilege, to use our ordinary privilege to talk to all of you wonderful people about these really importance about race. And so we're doing that. This is not the end of the conversation, but really the beginning. And to that end, we will have a very brief survey for you at the end of the session that will automatically pop up, that will ask you about what you thought of this series and what more we can be doing. And so I really encourage you to take just a couple of minutes and give us some feedback, and that will help us guide our way forward. But at the end of the day, we can, funding the work is important, educating ourselves is essential, but we cannot achieve our vision of a world without poverty unless and until we address racist policies. For those of you who have read Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, you know that what he's got to say is there is no such thing as a race-neutral policy. Policies either contribute to race equity or to race inequity. There are examples literally everywhere we look, excluding people in occupations who are dominated by people of color from the minimum wage, as a simple example, allowing credit checks to be part of a job application process. The home mortgage interest deduction, which just privileges those who have had the generational benefit of wealth to continue that inequity. The list goes on and on. We, to achieve our mission, we as Episcopal Impact Fund cannot sit on the sidelines, because inaction, it can be a form of racism too. So this is like a big step for the Episcopal Impact Fund to take, and we're probably not going to get there overnight, and we're probably going to need a lot of help. But we are committed as an organization to doing what it takes to figure it out. Just to close, I know we're a bit over time. The pre-reading that we were asked to do, Dolly Chugg's book, the You Mean to Be, is that right, Robert? It's close anyway, encourages all of us to be what she calls good-ish people, people who have the best intentions, but who are going to make mistakes as we stumble upward. What we ask for ourselves and what we ask for you and for the Episcopal Impact Fund as an organization is just grace. Grace as we stumble upwards toward becoming the Episcopal Impact Fund that we mean to be. We are so glad to be on this journey with you. I want to thank you for your time and joining along with us, and we will see you more in the future. So thank you, everybody, and good night.